The high plains of Wyoming were a hard country, a place that bleached bone and broke spirits. Near the Wind River Range, where the mountains clawed at a sky too big to comprehend, Jesse Cole moved with the seasons. He worked the cattle drives, pushing herds through dust and heat, and slept under the open stars. The ground was his bed, the saddle his pillow, and that was all the home he figured he deserved. He was a stoic man, quiet in a way that others found unsettling. His face was weathered leather, his eyes the color of a faded prairie sky, and they held a distance that few men tried to cross. He was good with cattle and better with horses, but he was a ghost among the living. Jesse was haunted, not by the men he'd seen fall in the war. He'd buried those memories deep, under layers of trail dust and whiskey. What haunted him came in fragments, in the dead hour before dawn when the fire was low. It was the face of a young woman, barely more than a girl, her features blurred by time and the haze of a night spent in a bottle. He'd dream of a hurried vow, the smell of lilac water and stale whiskey in a cramped room. He'd feel the scratch of a cheap wool suit he'd worn, and the weight of a ring in his hand. It had been in Kansas, years ago, a lifetime ago. He'd been raw, filled with fear and false courage, bound for a war he did not understand. He and the other boys had drunk themselves blind, and in that fever, he had done something. He had married her. He was almost sure of it. Then he had ridden off. He never went back. He never sent word. He'd told himself she was better off. He'd told himself the war had erased that night, that the Jesse Cole who'd made that promise had died somewhere in Tennessee, his blood soaking into the mud with all the others. He'd survived, but he'd left that part of himself behind, thinking it lost to time. His life now was one of solitude. When he wasn't on a drive, he took small jobs, fixing fences for homesteaders whose optimism he found baffling. He'd spend hours mending wire, the repetitive motion a comfort, the silence broken only by the wind and the nicker of his horse. He'd ride into the small, struggling settlement of Haven Creek, tie his horse outside the only saloon, and drink alone. He'd nurse a glass, watching the lamplight catch the amber liquid, saying nothing. The townsfolk knew him. He was seen as a kind man, in his way. He'd helped the farrier, Silas, when his forge roof collapsed. He'd shared his jerky with stranded travelers. But he was distant. He was the man you could count on to help, but never to stay for supper. He was a good man, they'd say, but one who carried a heavy load. Lately, that load felt heavier. A month prior, a dust storm had descended on Haven Creek like a biblical plague. The sky had turned a sickening yellow-brown, and for 2 days the wind had tried to scour the town from the earth. When it finally passed, it had taken half the settlement with it. The church steeple was gone. The general store was a skeleton, its contents scattered for miles. Jesse had ridden in and seen the devastation. He saw families huddled by the wreckage of their homes, their faces raw from the grit, and he'd felt a familiar, sickening twist in his gut. Guilt. It was the same guilt that woke him at night, a guilt born of cowardice. Not the cowardice of the battlefield, he'd stood his ground well enough there, but the deeper cowardice of a man who runs from his own life. He had run from that girl in Kansas, and seeing these people, so beaten but so determined to stay, felt like a judgment. So he stayed. He didn't ask for pay. He worked, he hauled timber, hammered nails, and helped reset the foundation of the mercantile. He worked until his shoulders screamed and his hands were raw, hoping the physical pain would quiet the noise in his head. It was a penance, though he'd never have called it that. It was on one of these rebuilding days that the stagecoach arrived. It was late, crawling into town just as the sun began to bleed into the western hills. The air was thick with the smell of fresh sawn pine and cook fire smoke. Jesse was on the mercantile porch, stacking looted sacks of flour that had been recovered, his shirt sticking to his back with sweat. The whole town, or what was left of it, seemed to pause. The stage meant mail, it meant supplies, and it meant news from the world that existed beyond this valley. The driver, wheezing with dust, climbed down and opened the door. A few passengers emerged, a drummer in a worn-out suit. A rancher Jessie recognized from the high country. And then, a woman. She stepped down onto the dusty street, her hand gripping the doorframe as if to steady herself. She was weary. That was the first thing Jessie noticed. The dust of 1,000 miles was settled into the creases of her pale green dress. Her bonnet was askew, and her face was pale from the relentless travel. She looked thin, worn down to the wire, but she stood straight. She paid the driver, her movements economical, and then lifted her head, scanning the small crowd that had gathered. Her eyes moved over the ruined buildings, the men working, the women pausing with laundry baskets. Then her gaze found Jessie. It wasn't a glance, it was a collision. Her eyes, a deep, tired gray, locked onto his. The world around Jessie went silent. The sound of the hammer ceased. The wind died. He saw a flicker of something in her expression, not surprise, but recognition. A painful, exhausted recognition. He stiffened, his hand hovering over a sack of flour. He did not know this woman. He was sure of it. Her face meant nothing to him. She took a hesitant step forward, her worn boots kicking up small puffs of alkali dust. The townsfolk watched, sensing something electric in the air. She stopped about 10 feet from him. She was close enough now that he could see the fine lines of hardship etched around her eyes and mouth. She looked older than her years, yet there was something in her face that tugged at the edges of his broken memory. "Jessie," she whispered. Her voice was soft, rough with dust. Jessie's blood ran cold. He said nothing. He simply stared, his mind racing, trying to place her. She seemed to take his silence as confusion, or perhaps the denial it truly was. She swallowed, gathering herself. "Jessie Cole," a murmur rippled through the onlookers. "Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, put a hand to her chest." "Ma'am," Jessie said, his voice grating. He finally dropped his hand from the flour sack and wiped it on his trousers. "I think you have me mistaken." The woman's expression did not change. She did not falter. She seemed to have expected this. "No," she said, a little stronger now. "There is no mistake." She reached for the small, battered reticule that hung from her wrist. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp. Not from nerves, Jessie thought, but from pure exhaustion. "I am Clara," she said, her voice clear in the sudden, terrible quiet. "Clara Byrne, though it's been Cole for 9 years." She looked directly into his eyes, bypassing the stunned and curious faces of the town. She held his gaze as she spoke the words that would tear his solitary life apart. "You're Jessie Cole, my husband." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the dust storm, more oppressive than the summer heat. Jessie felt every eye in Haven Creek turn to him. He felt their judgment, their shock, their sudden, hungry curiosity. His reputation as the quiet, distant man was vaporizing before his very eyes. His first instinct was denial, a hot, angry denial that rose in his throat. "That's a lie," he said, and the words came out harsher than he intended. "I ain't married. I don't know you." He saw her flinch, just a small tightening of her jaw. She had come all this way to be called a liar on a dusty street in front of strangers. A flash of shame hit him, but he buried it under a fresh wave of panic. "I believe you do," she said, her voice trembling slightly but not breaking. "You may not remember. You were not yourself. It was in Lawrence, 1866, just before you mustered out with the cavalry." The name of the town hit him like a fist. Lawrence. He had been there. He'd been paid out, him and the others, and they'd spent 3 days trying to drink the war out of their systems. It was a blur of noise, cheap whiskey, and crippling fear of what came next. "Ma'am, I'm telling you, you're wrong," he insisted, but the foundation was cracking beneath his feet. Clara's hand finally found what it was looking for in her bag. She pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and creased almost to breaking. She unfolded it with careful fingers. "The justice of the peace was named Miller," she said, holding the paper out for him. It was the 4th of May, a Thursday. Jessie stared at the document. He didn't move to take it. He could see the ornate script from where he stood. He saw his own name, Jesse T. Cole, scrawled in what was unmistakably his own hand, though shaky and rushed, and beneath it, Clara J. Byrne. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. "A marriage certificate," someone hissed. "That ain't proof," Jesse said, his voice low and threatening. "Paper can be faked." Clara's face hardened. The exhaustion was replaced by a flash of profound, weary anger. "Perhaps," she said, "but I doubt this can—" She did not reach into her bag. Instead, she slowly, deliberately, began to pull off her dusty glove. She worked the button at her wrist, her movements precise. She peeled the glove from her left hand, revealing fingers that were red and chapped from work, but her hand was steady. On her third finger was a simple, thin band of gold. It was nothing special. A cheap ring, bought from a sutler or a pawn shop. Jesse's heart stopped. His own hand, hidden by his side, instinctively clenched under his sweat-stained shirt. Hanging from a leather thong he'd worn for 9 years, a matching ring suddenly felt as heavy as an anvil. It was his secret, his burden, the one piece of that fever dream he could never bring himself to discard. He'd told himself it was a reminder of a fool's mistake, but he'd never, not once, admitted to another soul that it existed, and here was its twin, on the hand of a woman he'd sworn he didn't know. The blood drained from his face. The shock was so profound, so complete, that it left no room for words. The whispers of the town, the dust, the scent of the pine, it all faded away. There was only the woman, Clara, and the 9 years of silence that stood between them like a canyon. He was forced to see it, to face the truth he had buried in the mud of Tennessee and drowned in countless bottles. The past he thought had died with the war was standing right in front of him, weary and pale, but very much alive. He turned, not saying another word. He pushed past the onlookers, past the sacks of flour, and walked away. He didn't run. He walked with the stiff, blind purpose of a man who'd just been shot and didn't know where to fall. He heard her call his name once more, a broken, pleading sound, but he didn't stop. He untied his horse, mounted up, and rode out of Haven Creek, leaving the woman, the whispers, and the wreckage of his solitude behind him. He rode until the sun was long gone, but there was nowhere to go. The plains offered no escape. He was a man who lived under the open sky, and suddenly he felt trapped, the stars pressing down on him like the lid of a coffin. He made a cold camp miles from town, but he didn't build a fire. He sat with his back against his saddle, pulling a bottle of whiskey from his roll. He drank heavily, not for pleasure, not even for numbness, but in a desperate attempt to push the memory back down into the dark. It didn't work. The whiskey only sharpened the images. The fragmented dream coalesced into a sharp, agonizing memory. The girl's face finally had a name, Clara. She'd been younger then, barely 19, her eyes wide with a fear that matched his own. He remembered her hand, small and warm in his, as the justice spoke the words. He remembered the desperate, clumsy kiss in the boarding house room afterward. He remembered the terrible, aching guilt as he'd slipped out before dawn, riding south to rejoin his regiment, telling himself it was for the war, but knowing, even then, he was just a coward. He'd left her. He had married her, and, in the sober light of morning, he had abandoned her. He finished the bottle, the raw liquor burning his throat, but it couldn't touch the cold shame freezing him from the inside out. He was a man without a wife. He'd always thought a man alone, but the lie had been exposed. He was a husband. He was a deserter, not of the army, but of a vow. Jesse Cole leaned his head back, staring into the black, unforgiving void. Far to the north, over the mountains, the sky flickered. A low rumble, distant and faint, answered the turmoil in his chest. A storm was rolling across the plains. Jesse rode until the whiskey was gone and the false dawn painted the sky in a bruised, sickly gray. The storm had spat a cold rain for an hour, then moved on, leaving the air sharp and clean. He hadn't slept. He'd sat against his saddle, the empty bottle in his hand, and let the memories he'd held at bay for 9 years wash over him. He was a husband. He had a wife, A son. He'd had a son. That last thought was a physical blow, striking him over and over. A child. A boy. A life that had sparked and died in the shadow of his own cowardice. The guilt was no longer a dull ache. It was a living thing, with teeth and claws, tearing him apart from the inside. There was no running from this. The plains were vast, but they were not vast enough to hide him from what he'd done. Slowly, stiffly, he got to his feet. He saddled his horse, his movements automatic. He had left her standing on that porch, alone, surrounded by strangers. He had run. Again. He rode back to Haven Creek. The sun was just breaking as he reached the edge of the ruined town. The day's work had not yet begun, but the whispers had. He saw them as he dismounted, tying his horse to the same rail. Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, was speaking in a low, urgent tone to Silas, the farrier. When they saw Jesse, they fell silent, their faces a mixture of judgment and pity. The town, he realized, had already tried and convicted him. And he saw her. She was sitting on the porch of the mercantile, right where he had left her. She hadn't moved, though he knew she must have. Her valise was beside her. She looked as if she had turned to stone, her gaze fixed on the wreckage of the church across the street. The whispers followed him as he crossed the street. "Got no land to speak of," a man muttered from the saloon doorway. "Just his horse and saddle. What's she after?" "Reputation," another scoffed. "His reputation is for drinking quiet and working hard. Ain't nothing to claim there. She's a grifter." "Mrs. Davies pronounced, loud enough for Jesse to hear. "Coming here with a piece of paper, trying to lay claim to a man who's barely got a name. Shameful." Jesse stopped, his hand dropping to the butt of his revolver. The casual cruelty of it. After what he turned his head, his eyes burning, but he said nothing. He had no right to defend her. He was the one who had made her a target. He walked onto the porch. His boots were loud on the warped planks. Clara did not look up. She seemed to be in a place beyond hearing. He stood before her, a mountain of shame. The storm had passed, but another was building inside him. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. "Ma'am?" he started. She flinched, as if waking from a nightmare. She looked up at him, and her eyes were hollow. There was no anger left, just a bone-deep exhaustion that matched his own. He couldn't meet her gaze. He looked at the cracked planking between his boots. "You can't stay out here. The storm. It'll be back tonight. Colder." He was ashamed to send her away, but he was too proud, too broken, to offer her anything real. He had no home. He had no inside to offer. He'd been sleeping in the hayloft above the livery stable while he helped with the rebuilding. He gestured vaguely toward the livery. "Silas, he's got an empty stall. It's dry. There's clean straw." He was offering her a place fit for an animal. The words hung in the air, a final, brutal insult. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He could feel her gaze on him, dissecting him. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, devoid of the fire from yesterday. "A stall. It's all I got," he mumbled, his face burning. She rose to her feet. She was not tall, but she stood with a straightness that made her seem so... She was not a weeping girl. She was a woman made of iron and grief. "I did not travel for 2 months, sleeping in ditches and wagon beds, to be offered a stall. Jesse." She picked up her valise. "I did not come here for your pity. I did not come here for your protection, and I certainly did not come here for your money, seeing as you have none." "Then why?" he finally asked, his voice raw. "Why did you come? To ruin me." "Ruin you?" A small, bitter laugh escaped her. "You think this is ruin? You have a horse. You have your freedom. You have a name that people speak without scorn." She clutched her valise to her chest, as if it were a shield. "I came for the truth. I came because I had to see the man who signed that paper. I had to know if he was real, or if he was just a ghost I had invented." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "My conscience demanded it. I could not move on with my life. I could not go to my grave knowing I had been tied to a shadow. I came to find you, to look you in the eye, and to have you acknowledge what you did. Then I was going to leave. I was going to set us both free. That is all I wanted." The wind was picking up again, whipping strands of her dark hair across her pale face. The sky was darkening to the west. "I have no money," he repeated, helplessly. "I can't give you anything." "I don't want anything," she said, her voice rising with the wind. "I wanted you to remember." "I remember flashes," he admitted, the confession torn from him. "A room, a man, Miller, the promise." "Ah, yes," she said, her eyes flashing. "The promise." The first heavy drops of rain began to fall. They were cold, striking the dust around their feet. Jesse was torn. He couldn't leave her here. He couldn't. His guilt, his shame. It was all tangled up with the image of her, alone, in the rain. "Get inside," he said, grabbing her arm. His grip was rougher than he intended. "Inside where?" she spat, trying to pull away. "Your stall." "The livery. Get out of the rain, damn it." He didn't let go. He pulled her, half dragging her, across the street. The townsfolk watched from their windows, their face pale blurs. He shoved open the wide livery door. The barn was dark, smelling of hay, horse, and old leather. The wind howled outside, and the rain began to drum hard on the tin roof. It was a sudden, violent deluge. He let go of her arm. They stood in the dimness, breathing heavily. The only light came from the open doorway. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked, her voice quiet in the sudden shelter. "Not really. Not what mattered." Jesse walked away from her, deeper into the shadows. He ran a hand through his damp hair. "I told you, it was a long time ago. I was drunk." "I was not," she said. "I was 17 years old, and I was terrified. But I wasn't drunk." She set her valise down. She would not be silenced. Not now. "It was the 4th of May, she began, her voice taking on a distant, reciting tone. "A Thursday. You were leaving the next morning to rejoin the cavalry. You and those other boys. You'd been drinking since you got your pay. You found me in the hotel dining room where I was working." Jesse leaned against a support beam, his back to her. He remembered. He remembered her face, pale and serious, as she served them coffee. "You kept talking to me. You said I had kind eyes. You said you were afraid you wouldn't come back from the war." The rain hammered the roof, a relentless drumbeat to her words. "We went to the justice of the peace, Mr. Miller. He was an old man, and he didn't want to do it. He said you were too drunk and I was too young. But you gave him $10. You said you were a soldier, and it was your right." Jesse closed his eyes. He remembered the greasy $10 bill. "We went to my room at the boarding house. It was small. It smelled of lilac water. You held my hand, and you swore to me. You swore on your mother's grave that as soon as the war was over, you would send for me. You said we'd go west, Oregon, maybe. You promised, Jesse." "The war, it didn't end," he whispered to the shadows. "No, it didn't," she agreed, her voice hardening. "Christmas came. Then another summer. I wrote to you. I sent letters to every regiment I could find. They all came back, or they didn't come back at all." She stepped closer to him in the gloom. "The women in the boarding house, they stopped being kind. At first, I was the brave soldier's wife. Then, I was just the girl who'd been left. They started to whisper. They said you'd run off. They said you were a deserter." Jesse spun around, his face agonized in the dim light. "I never deserted. I fought. I fought at Shiloh. I fought till the surrender. I saw things." "It doesn't matter what you did there," she cried, her voice echoing in the rafters. The horses in their stalls shifted nervously. "You deserted me. That was the only war they cared about, and I was the one who paid for it. They called me your whore. They said I'd lied about the wedding." He stared at her, speechless. The weight of her 9 years of suffering was crushing him. "And then," she said, her voice dropping, breaking, "the baby came." The world stopped. The rain, the wind, the horses, it all went silent. Jesse's blood turned to ice. He could not have heard her right. What? He was born that winter, she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. After you'd been gone almost a year, a boy. I named him Thomas. Jesse felt the floor give way. He reached out, grabbing the rough wood of the stall to keep from falling. A baby. A son? He had your eyes, I think, she said, her voice choked with a grief so old it was part of her. It was hard, so hard. I had no money. No one would hire the deserter's wife. I scrubbed floors. I took in mending, but that winter, it was so cold, colder than this. She was weeping now, silent, terrible tears that ran down her dusty cheeks. He caught a fever, his lungs. He couldn't breathe. I begged the doctor, but he wanted money I didn't have. I sold everything. I sold the ring you gave me. Jesse's hand instinctively went to his own chest, to the ring on its leather thong. It wasn't enough, she choked out. He died. He was 7 months old. I buried him myself, in the churchyard. The ground was frozen. Jesse made a sound, a low, animal sound of pure agony. He turned and struck the support beam with his fist. The wood was unyielding. The pain shot up his arm, but it was nothing. It was a distant pinprick compared to the chasm that had just opened inside him. A son who had died of cold and sickness while Jesse was, what, drinking, riding, trying to forget. His cowardice hadn't just left a girl in trouble. It had killed a child. His child. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't breathe. He was torn apart, not by disbelief, but by the terrible, absolute certainty of her truth. He slid down the beam, crouching in the straw, his head in his hands. He was a broken man, brought low by the ghosts he had created. He didn't know how long they stayed like that. The storm raged. And then, as it had the night before, it passed. The livery grew quiet, save for the drip of water from the eaves and the sound of Clara's ragged breathing. Finally, his voice thick, he said, "The loft. You take the loft." He didn't wait for an answer. He climbed the ladder into the darkness, gathered his saddle blanket and the thin bedroll he kept there, and tossed them down onto the hay-strewn floor. He didn't look at her. "It's dry," he said. Then he descended, walking past her into the empty stall he had first offered her. He sat, his back against the rough sawn planks, and stared into the blackness. He heard her, after a long time, climb the ladder. He heard the rustle of the hay as she lay down, and then there was only silence, and the sound of his own heart, which felt as if it would never beat right again. The next morning, Jesse awoke, stiff and cold, to the sound of hammers. The town was already at work, cleaning up the new damage from the night's storm. He hadn't slept. He had simply existed. He emerged from the livery, blinking in the bright, scrubbed light. His head ached. His soul ached. He saw her, across the street. Clara was already there, at the mercantile. Her dress was rumpled from the hay, but she had pinned her hair back up. She looked pale, but she was not idle. He watched from the shadows of the livery, unable to move. The town was alive with activity, but there was a circle of silence around Clara. The other women, Mrs. Davies, the Miller sisters, the preacher's wife, they worked near her, but not with her. They handed nails and timbers over and around her, as if she were invisible. Their stares were cold. Their whispers were sharp. Clara did not falter. She did not ask for a task. She simply saw what needed doing. She was helping Mr. and Mrs. Miller, whose dry goods had been soaked again. She was hauling sodden sacks of flour and beans out onto the porch to dry, her thin arms straining with the weight. Jesse watched her. He was seeing her for the first time, not as the blurry girl from a drunken memory, not as the accusing ghost from yesterday, but as a woman of quiet, terrifying strength. He saw Mrs. Miller cut her hand on a piece of jagged tin. She cursed, dropping a sack, and blood welled up. The other women clucked in sympathy, but no one moved to help. Clara, without a word, put down the sack she was carrying. She knelt by her own valise, opened it, and pulled out a strip of clean white cloth. It looked like part of a petticoat. She walked over to Mrs. Miller, took the older woman's bleeding hand, and gently, firmly, wrapped the bandage around the cut. Mrs. Miller stared, shocked into silence. Thank you, she stammered. Clara just nodded, her face unreadable, and went back to work. Jesse felt something move in his chest, a painful, thawing sensation, an emotion he had buried so long ago he no longer had a name for it. It was respect, it was awe, and it was a guilt so profound it made him sick. This was the woman he had abandoned. This was the woman whose child he had allowed to die. He spent the day working on the far side of town, shoeing horses with Silas. He couldn't go near her. He couldn't bear her quiet grace, or the judgment of the town. He worked until his muscles burned. But the image of her bandaging Mrs. Miller's hand would not leave him. That night, he found himself outside the livery. He had a fresh bottle of whiskey, bought with some of the last of his pay from the cattle drive. He had a lantern. He didn't know what he planned to say. He only knew he could not sit alone in that stall again. He lit the lantern, the small flame casting a warm, yellow glow. He entered the barn. "Clara," he called softly. She was there, sitting in the open door of the loft, her feet dangling above the barn floor. She was watching the sliver of moon rise over the prairie. He climbed the ladder, the lantern in one hand, the bottle in the other. He felt clumsy, like a boy. He sat on the loft floor, a few feet away from her, and set the lantern between them. The light illuminated their faces, casting huge, flickering shadows on the wall behind them. He held out the bottle. "It ain't much, but it might take the chill off." She looked at the bottle, then at him. A sad smile touched her lips. "That's what started this whole thing, isn't it? Whiskey." But she took it. She held it for a moment, then took a small, careful sip. She coughed, the raw liquor burning her throat, and handed it back. He took a drink himself. It tasted like ash. They sat in silence for a long time. The sounds of the night, the horses shifting below, the call of a distant coyote drifting in. "I am sorry, Clara," he said, the words feeling small and useless. For all of it. For the boy. Thomas." She nodded, staring out at the plains. "I know. I don't remember him," he whispered, ashamed. I don't remember that night. Not clearly. I remember your face. I remember the ring. But it was a blur. I was so drunk, and so scared of the fighting ahead. "I remember all of it," she said, her voice soft. "Every word, every promise. I held on to it for years. It was all I had." A tense, heavy silence settled between them. It was filled with pain, with the 9 lost years, with confusion. But as he looked at her in the warm lantern light, he felt something else, too. She was not the pale, plain girl he had married. Grief and hardship had carved her face into something strong, something beautiful. The set of her jaw, the deepness of her gray eyes, the way her hands lay folded in her lap. They stirred something in him, a long-dead, flickering warmth. She must have felt it too. She turned from the view and looked at him, really looked at him. Her gaze was searching, as if trying to find the drunken boy she had married inside this scarred, haunted man. "I hated you for so long," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "When Thomas was sick, every time he coughed, I cursed your name. I prayed to God to save him, and I prayed to God to damn you." Jesse flinched, but he accepted the words. He deserved them. "But I couldn't stop," she whispered, looking down at her own hands. "I couldn't stop loving the boy who said I had kind eyes, the one who promised to take me to Oregon. I think that's what I hated most of all, that I still loved him." Her confession hung in the air, a fragile, impossible thing. Jesse's heart ached. He wasn't thinking. He was moving on pure, starved instinct. He reached across the small space that separated them and laid his hand over hers. His calloused, rough fingers covered the back of her chapped hand. A jolt went through both of them. It was a spark, a sudden, terrifying heat that had nothing to do with the lantern. It was the shock of human touch after a lifetime of cold. He felt her tremble. Her skin was warm. She looked down at his hand on hers. Then slowly, she raised her eyes to his. Her pupils were wide. Her lips parted. In her expression, he saw it all, the pain, the confusion, and the same lingering, undeniable attraction he felt. For a heartbeat, they just stared, caught in the pull of 9 years of compressed loneliness. Then, Clara pulled her hand away. She didn't snatch it. She drew it back deliberately, closing it into a fist in her lap. "No," she said. "Clara," he started, his voice thick. "No." She stood up, moving out of the lantern's glow, back into the shadows of the loft. Her voice was firm, but shaking. "Love can't survive lies. Jesse, and our whole life." It was built on one. "Your promise, my waiting, it was all a lie." She turned her back to him, a rigid silhouette against the hay. The conversation was over. Jesse sat there for a long time, the bottle of whiskey in his hand, the lantern light flickering on his face. He could still feel the warmth of her skin on his fingers. He had been a man alone, haunted by a ghost. Now, the ghost was real, sleeping 10 feet away from him, and he had never, in all his solitary life, felt more completely alone. The days that followed crawled by, each one cementing Clara's status as an outcast. Jesse returned to the rebuilding, but the atmosphere had changed. The easy, quiet respect the townsfolk had afforded him was gone, replaced by sidelong glances and hushed, condemning conversations. He was no longer the stoic, helpful stranger. He was the man with the mysterious, shameful past. And Clara was the center of that shame. She bore the town's scorn with a silence that Jesse found more unsettling than tears. He'd see her walking to the mercantile, her back straight, her head high, as Mrs. Davies and the Miller sisters stopped talking, their eyes following her with open hostility. They did not call her a liar to her face. They didn't have to. The air crackled with their judgment. A woman scorned. Jesse heard Silas, the farrier, mutter to another man. "Ain't nothing more dangerous." "Scorned?" the other man scoffed. "She's a grifter, plain and simple. Look at her, pretending to be decent. I'd wager she's got a paper like that for a man in every territory." Jesse's hands, which were restringing wire on a fence post, tightened until his knuckles were white. He did not look up. He just kept twisting the wire, the metal biting into his leather gloves. Clara continued to live in the hayloft. She had tried to offer Mrs. Miller money for a room at the boarding house, the few dollars she had left, but the woman had refused her, saying they were full. Clara accepted this, as she accepted everything, with a quiet, unyielding dignity. She took to mending clothes for the men working the rebuild, earning a few cents here and there, enough for flour and beans. She asked nothing of Jesse. She spoke to him only when necessary. They were two ghosts, haunting the same small patch of dirt, tied together by a past he couldn't fully remember and she couldn't forget. The breaking point came on a Saturday night. The saloon was full, the air thick with sweat, cheap whiskey, and the weary frustration of men who had been working for weeks with little to show for it. Jesse was in his usual corner, nursing a glass, trying to drown the image of his son. Thomas, a boy with his eyes, a face he had never seen but could not stop picturing. Clara was walking past the saloon, heading back to the livery after delivering a mended shirt to one of the hands. She kept her eyes on the opposite side of the street, quickening her pace to pass the pools of yellow light and noise. A man named Hank, a teamster who'd been drinking steady since sundown, saw her silhouette past the window. He was a big, loud man, angry at the world. "There she goes," he bellowed, slamming his glass down. "Cole's Kansas harlot, pretending she's too good to look this way." The saloon went quiet. Jesse Cole did not look up. He did not move. He just stared into his whiskey. Hank, emboldened by the silence, laughed. "What's the matter? Cole?" She wear you out, or did you finally figure out she ain't really your wife? A man would have to be blind drunk to hitch himself to that." Jesse set his glass down on the bar. The small click was the only sound in the room. He turned, not fast, but with a terrible smoothness. His eyes, usually distant and faded, were now sharp and cold as ice chips. "That's enough, Hank," he said, his voice low. "Or what?" Hank sneered, pushing himself away from his table. He was enjoying the attention. "You gonna deny it? We all know what she is. She comes here with some story, moves right into your barn. It's a disgrace." Jesse walked across the room. He didn't rush. He stopped when he was close enough for Hank to smell the whiskey on his breath. "You will not," Jesse said, his voice a gravelly whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "Speak her name." "I'll speak it all I want," Hank taunted, and he made the mistake of pushing Jesse in the shoulder. It was not a push. It was a trigger. Jesse moved faster than any man there had ever seen him move. He did not throw a punch. He grabbed the front of Hank's shirt, twisting it, and slammed the bigger man back against the wall. The impact shook the bottles behind the bar. Jesse's forearm was pressed across Hank's throat, cutting off his air. With his other hand, Jesse's hand, the one that had fixed fences and held whiskey glasses, dropped. It didn't draw the revolver. It just rested on the worn wooden grip. The saloon held its breath. This was not the kind, distant man they knew. This was a killer. The war was suddenly right there in the room, burning in Jesse's eyes. "I said," Jesse repeated, his voice shaking with a fury that terrified even him. "That's enough!" Hank's face was turning a deep red. His eyes bulged. He clawed at Jesse's arm, but it was like iron. He tried to speak, but only a choked gurgle came out. "Jesse, Silas, the farrier, spoke from the bar. That's enough. Let him go." Jesse stared into Hank's panicked eyes for one more second, the violence singing in his blood, a hot, terrible relief. Then, as quickly as he'd grabbed him, he let go. Hank collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing. Jesse Cole stood there, breathing heavily, his hand still on the grip of his gun. The room stared at him in shocked silence. He looked around, his gaze settling on each man, one by one. No one met his eye. He turned, threw 2 coins on the bar for the whiskey, and walked out into the night. He had shocked them all, but no one was more shocked than himself. He had almost drawn his gun. He had almost killed a man, not for his own honor, which he cared nothing for, but for hers. He found her in the livery, brushing down his horse. She must have heard the commotion. She turned as he entered, her face pale in the lantern light. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing," he grated, walking past her to the stall he used. "Just a drunk man running his mouth." She stopped brushing. "About me." It wasn't a question. Jesse didn't answer. He leaned against the stall, the fury draining out of him, leaving him cold and empty. Clara put the brush down and came to stand near him, though she kept her distance. "You shouldn't have done that. Jesse, it only makes it worse. For both of us." "So I should let them?" he shot back, his voice harsh. "I should let them call you that? After what I did? After what I cost you?" "It doesn't matter what they call me," she said, her voice weary. "It only matters what's true. And the truth is, you did run. I am the woman who was left. Fighting Hank won't change that." Her words cut him deeper than Hank's insults. He had no answer. The incident, however, changed something between them. The next day, which was Sunday, Clara went to the makeshift service the preacher was holding in the mercantile. When it was over, and she stepped out into the harsh sunlight, Jesse was there, waiting by his horse. He didn't speak. He just watched her. The rest of the congregation filed out, giving them both a wide berth. Clara hesitated, then started the walk back to the livery. Jesse fell into step beside her. He didn't speak. She didn't speak, but he walked with her, his presence a silent, public declaration. He was making amends, in the only way his stoic, broken pride knew how. He was standing with her. It became their routine. When she went to the store, he would be there, waiting, to walk her back. When she took mending to a customer, he would follow at a distance, ensuring she got there and back without incident. The town's gossip didn't stop, but it quieted. The fury in Jesse's eyes that night had been a powerful warning. Their silent walks turned into quiet evenings. The wall of anger and grief between them had been breached. They began to sit by the corral after the day's work was done, the sky a riot of purple and orange. They started to talk. Not about the war, not about the baby. Not yet. They talked about the land, about the horses, about the cold that was already creeping into the nights. Then, one evening, Jesse found himself talking about the war. He spoke of a friend, a boy from Ohio named Elijah, who had died beside him at Shiloh. He talked about the guilt of being the one to walk away. He liked to read poetry, Jesse said, staring at the dark line of the mountains. He was always talking about what he'd do after, open a school. He was 19. Clara listened, her hands clasped in her lap. When he fell silent, she spoke, her voice soft. Thomas liked the sound of the wind chimes, she said. Jesse's breath caught. It was the first time she had offered a memory of their son, instead of just the fact of his death. I hung some little tin ones I'd made, outside the window, she continued, her gaze far away. He was so small, but when the wind blew, he would stop crying. He would just listen. His eyes would get so wide. Jesse closed his own eyes. He could see it. He could almost hear it. They sat in the gathering dark, two souls bound by what they had lost. He had lost his comrades. She had lost their child. The grief was the only ground they truly shared. A few days later, Clara did something that baffled the town. She found a small, fallow patch of earth behind the livery, a place choked with weeds and rocks. She asked Silas if she could use it. He grunted, saying it was worthless, but he didn't stop her. Jesse found her there, using a broken shovel head to try and turn the hard, dry soil. It's too late in the season to plant, he said, stopping beside her. It's not for a harvest, she replied, not pausing in her work. It's for a start. Carrots will last. If the ground is turned, maybe some kale. It's just to have something in the ground, something that's mine. He watched her struggle for a moment. The soil was like stone. Give me that, he said, taking the shovel head from her. He went to the forge and came back with a heavy pickaxe. He worked for an hour, his muscles straining, the rhythmic thud of the pick biting into the earth. He broke the soil, row by row, while she followed behind, pulling out the rocks and weeds. They worked in tandem, a silent team. When he was done, sweating and breathing hard, he looked at the small patch of turned earth. It looked hopeful. Clara was kneeling, smoothing the dirt with her bare hands. A stray chicken, one of Silas's, came pecking nearby, eyeing the freshly dug worms. Shoo, Jesse said, waving at it. The chicken hopped back, then darted in again, stealing a worm right from under Clara's hand. Persistent, Clara murmured. Stubborn, Jesse corrected, nudging the bird with his boot. Thinks he owns the place. Clara looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. He reminds me of you. Jesse stared at her. Then, a sound he hadn't heard in years rumbled in his chest. It was a short, rusty bark, a laugh. He looked at the chicken, then at her. I suppose he does. At that, he said, and Clara laughed. It was a soft sound, like wind chimes. It was the first time. The sound was so unexpected, so beautiful. It silenced the noise in his head. They stood there in the setting sun, smiling at each other. For that one moment, they were not the broken man and the abandoned woman. They were just Jesse and Clara, standing in a garden. The moment passed. The smiles faded. The internal war resumed. Jesse looked at her, at the peace her smile had brought him, and he hated himself for it. What right do you have? A voice in his head snarled. A man who let his child die doesn't get to laugh. He doesn't deserve this happiness. Clara, too, felt the pull of guilt. His laugh. It was the laugh of the boy she'd married. It was the sound she had longed to hear for 9 years, and now that it was here, it felt like a betrayal. How can I laugh with him? How can I forgive him? She thought, her heart twisting. Is it weakness? Am I forgetting my son? The thaw between them was fragile, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river of guilt. A few days later, the sky turned a familiar, angry yellow. The wind began to pick up, howling down from the wind rivers. Another storm was coming, meaner than the last. Store's almost out of everything, Silas announced, nailing a loose board on his barn. That wind is bringing snow with it. I'll wager we need supplies from the depot at South Pass, or we'll be starving by first snow. The depot was a full day's ride. Jesse volunteered. I'll take the wagon. You'll need help if the storm hits, Silas said, before anyone could speak. Clara stepped forward. I'll go. I can manage a team. Jesse looked at her, about to object, but he saw the set of her jaw. She was tired of being useless, of being the town's charity case. This was her way of contributing. Fine, Jesse said. They left before dawn, the sky a threatening gray. They rode in the wagon for hours, the wind at their backs, pushing them south. They didn't speak of their inner conflicts. They spoke only of the wagon, the horses, and the darkening sky. They reached the depot, loaded the wagon with sacks of flour, salted pork, and coffee, and turned back. They were halfway home when the storm hit. It was not a gentle snow. It was a wall of white, a blizzard that descended from the mountains with breathtaking speed. The wind turned, hitting them head-on, driving ice and sleet that stung their faces like needles. We can't make it, Jesse yelled over the roar of the wind. The horses were stumbling, panicked. We'll be lost in 10 minutes. There, Clara pointed, her voice thin in the gale. To the east, a cabin. Jesse squinted. He could barely see his hand in front of his face, but she was right. A dark shape, a smudge against the white, an old line cabin, abandoned by some hopeful shepherd years ago. He turned the team, fighting them against the wind, and aimed for the shadow. The wagon crashed through the snowdrifts, and they stumbled to a halt beside the dilapidated structure. Get inside, he roared, jumping down. I'll unhitch the team and get them on the lee side. Clara nodded, her face already white with frost. She grabbed a blanket and the lantern from the wagon and ran, pushing open the rotted door of the cabin. Jesse fought the panicked horses, his hands already numb. He unhitched their traces, slapping their rumps to get them to huddle against the cabin wall, out of the worst of the wind. He grabbed his bedroll and the axe and plunged through the snow to the cabin. He burst inside, slamming the door against the gale. The wind screamed through the cracks in the walls. It was dark, smelled of pack rats and decay, and was barely warmer than outside. Clara was kneeling in the center, struggling with the lantern. Her hands were shaking too badly to strike a match. Jesse knelt beside her, his own hand stiff and clumsy. He took the matches, struck one, and lit the wick. A small, brave circle of yellow light pushed back the gloom. They were in a single room, a broken bunk, a rusted stove, and a pile of old firewood in the corner. Thank God, Jesse breathed. He went to the stove. It was intact. He used the axe to split the dry old wood, and within minutes, he had a small, struggling fire going. They huddled over it, shivering, their teeth chattering. They were soaked to the bone. We'll be here till it breaks, Jesse said, his voice grim. Could be hours, could be days. Clara just nodded, her eyes fixed on the small flames. As the fire grew, the tiny cabin began to warm. The shivering subsided, but the cold had settled deep in their bones. Jesse took a swallow of the whiskey he kept for emergencies, then passed the flask to her. She drank, coughing, the liquid burning a trail down to her stomach. Jesse pulled off his heavy, frozen coat. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, trying to get the feeling back in his fingers. He winced, a sharp, sudden pain. What is it? Clara asked, her voice sharp. Nothing, just the cold. No, she said, moving closer. You've been favoring that shoulder since the saloon. Let me see. It's fine. Clara, let me see. Jesse, she insisted. He sighed, the fight gone out of him. The storm, the cold, the close quarters. It was all too much. He turned his back to her slightly. The cold had settled in his old wound, the one he'd carried since Shiloh. It was an aching, vicious pain. Clara moved behind him. Your shirt, she said, her voice quiet. He hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned the damp flannel. He pulled it off his right shoulder, exposing his side and back to the firelight. She drew in a sharp breath. The skin on his left side was a ruin of old scar tissue, puckered and white. A piece of shrapnel had torn through him, and the army surgeon had done a butcher's job of patching it up. The cold had turned the scar a mottled, angry purple. It's just old, he mumbled, embarrassed. She didn't answer. She reached into her valise, she never went anywhere without it, and pulled out a small tin. What's that? A salve, for burns and old aches. She opened it. The smell of pine and camphor filled the small room. She dipped her fingers into the tin, then moved to sit beside him. Hold still. Her fingers, now warm from the fire, touched his skin. Jesse trembled. It was not the cold. It was her. Her touch was soft, hesitant at first, then firmer as she began to rub the salve into the rigid, aching scar tissue. It was the first time she had touched him in kindness, in intimacy. In 9 years, it was an agony. It was a relief. The tension in the cabin became thick, almost unbearable. There was only the sound of the wind screaming outside, the crackle of the fire, and the soft, circular motion of her hand on his skin. He could feel her breath on his back. He was intensely aware of her knee, pressed lightly against his hip. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, his fists clenched. She worked in silence, her touch gentle but firm, breaking down the cold knots in the old muscle. He could feel the warmth spreading, not just from the salve, but from her hand. She finished, but her hand lingered on his shoulder. He could feel her trembling. Too. Jesse, she whispered, her voice thick. He didn't move. He couldn't. I don't hate you anymore, she said, her voice breaking. She wept, but she did it quietly, the tears falling onto his back. I tried so hard, but I can't. I can't erase those years. I sat in that room. I waited. Every day. For 2 years. I sat by that window and waited for a letter. I waited for you. How do I stop waiting for a man who never came? Her pain lanced through him, sharper than the shrapnel had. He turned, slowly, to face her. Her face was streaked with tears, illuminated by the fire. He was still half undressed, his scar exposed. He felt flayed open, inside and out. He had to tell her. He had to make her understand. I didn't come back, he said, his voice raw. Because I was a coward. Of the war, she asked. No, he shook his head, looking down at his own scarred hands. Of you. I remembered. Clara, I remembered it all. The wedding, your face, my promise. And the more I remembered, the more I was ashamed. The war, it broke something in me. I saw things. I did things. I was not the boy you married. I was a ghost. I was poison. He looked up, his eyes tortured. I told myself you were better off. I told myself you'd forget me, that you'd find a good man, a whole man, not me. I thought a broken man would only bring you ruin. I didn't come back because I hated myself, Clara, and I believed you were better off without me. His confession, the deepest, ugliest truth in him, lay bare between them. She stared at him. Her tears stopped. She searched his face, seeing not the deserter, not the ghost, but the broken, self-hating man who had exiled himself out of a twisted sense of protection. You were wrong, she whispered. That was all it took. The 9 years of silence, the cold, the grief, the storm. It all shattered. He reached for her, his hands desperate, pulling her to him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was a drowning man's grasp for air. His mouth found hers, and it was a taste of whiskey and salt and 9 years of loneliness. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his unwounded shoulder. her sob muffled against his lips. It was grief, and it was passion, and it was a desperate, terrible need. They fell back onto his bedroll by the fire, a tangle of limbs and damp clothes. This was not about love. Not yet. It was about pain. It was about memory. It was a desperate, cathartic union, a raw and frantic attempt to reclaim the years the war and his shame had stolen. Outside, the wind howled like a grieving animal. But inside the small cabin, by the dying fire, two ghosts were desperately trying to prove to each other that they were still alive. The storm broke just before dawn. The world it left behind was scrubbed clean, the air so cold and sharp it hurt to breathe. The snow had melted under the force of the rain, leaving the prairie a vast, muddy expanse. They rode in silence, the wagon wheels sucking at the mud. The physical warmth that had passed between them in the cabin, the desperate, grieving passion, had cooled with the fire. Now, in the gray light of morning, it was a new, heavier barrier between them. Guilt, sharp and cold, sat beside Jessie in the wagon. He had taken her in that small, storm-racked cabin. He had used her grief, and his own, to satisfy a loneliness so deep he hadn't known it had a name. He had given her comfort, perhaps, but he had also taken the last thing she had, and he had done it knowing he was still the same broken man who had abandoned her 9 years ago. Clara sat with her hands clenched in her lap, her face turned away. Watching the mountains emerge from the mist, she felt raw, exposed. She had wept in his arms. She had let him see the ugliest parts of her grief, and she had wanted him. She had met his desperation with her own. Now, in the cold light, she felt ashamed. She had betrayed the memory of her son. She had forgiven the man she'd sworn to hate. They rolled into Haven Creek just as the sun broke the horizon. The town was assessing the new damage from the storm. A window curtain moved. Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, was watching. She saw them. She saw Jessie, his face dark with stubble and exhaustion. She saw Clara, her hair undone, her dress rumpled, sitting beside him on the wagon seat. She saw them return, together, from a night spent in the wilderness. By the time Jessie had unhitched the team and Clara had carried her valise back to the livery, the rumor was already spreading, faster and hotter than any prairie fire. They had been seen. They had spent the night alone. The supplies in the wagon were forgotten. The rescue from the storm was irrelevant. All that mattered was the sin. That day was Sunday. The storm had passed, and Preacher Josiah Davies was determined to hold his service. With the church half gone, he stood on the wide, splintered porch of the mercantile, his Bible in his hand. The townsfolk gathered, their faces grim. Rebuilding their town, to the preacher, meant purifying it first. Jessie and Clara stood at the edge of the small crowd, near the back. They needed to be there to get their share of the supplies they had just risked their lives for. But their presence turned the air electric. The sermon began with resilience. Preacher Davies spoke of Job, of trials by wind and dust. He praised the hands that were rebuilding their settlement. Then, his voice hardened. He raised his Bible, pointing not at the crowd, but at the sky. "We cannot ask the Lord to bless this new beginning if we allow the serpent to twist among us," he boomed, his voice rolling across the street. "We cannot rebuild a house of God if we build a house of sin beside it." Jessie stiffened. He saw Hank, the teamster, smirk from the crowd. "There are those who come here with false papers," the preacher cried, his eyes finding Clara. "Those who claim the sanction of marriage, yet live in barns. Those who would use a storm as an excuse for fornication." The word hung in the cold, clear air. Fornication. Clara's face went white. She looked as if she'd been struck. She made a small move, to turn, to run, but Jessie's hand shot out and gripped her arm, holding her in place, not in comfort, but in defiance. "He speaks of a document he has not seen," Jessie said, his voice low, but it cut through the preacher's pause. The crowd turned, shocked. Preacher Davies glared at him. "I speak of what I see. Mr. Cole, I see two people, unmarried in the eyes of God. Sharing a wagon at dawn, I see a mockery of the Holy Union. That paper is legal, Jesse said, his voice cold and flat. Signed by a justice. You have no right. I have God's right, Davies roared. You live in sin. You shame this town, which we are trying to rebuild in his image. You will repent this or you will leave. Jesse took a step forward. The fury that had taken him in the saloon was back, but it was colder, deadlier. He saw the hypocrisy in their faces, the men who spent their nights with saloon girls, the women who fueled their days with malicious gossip. And they dared. They dared to judge her. You, Jesse said, pointing a finger at the preacher, know nothing of sin. You know nothing of her. You hide behind that book. But you're just a bully, afraid of what you don't understand. Jesse, no. Clara was pulling at his sleeve, her voice desperate. Please don't. It only makes it worse. Let's go. He looked at her. Her face was a mask of terror. She was right. He was not fighting the preacher. He was fighting the whole town. His anger was a weapon, but it was only hurting her. It was proving them right. He let the breath out of his lungs. He gave the preacher one last look of pure, unadulterated contempt, then turned. He pushed his way through the crowd, pulling Clara with him. They did not take their supplies. They walked back to the livery, the silence of the town a heavy weight on their backs. Their relationship, already a fragile, wounded thing, now had to survive in the open. The night in the cabin had changed everything. It was no longer a secret, but a public crime. The days that followed were a strange balance of quiet tenderness and profound guilt. The mornings were theirs. He would find her in the hayloft, where she had brushed out her hair, and he would share the hot, bitter coffee he'd brewed over a small fire. Their hands would brush as he passed her the cup. They would talk, in low voices, about the horses, about the coming cold. In the thin morning light, they were just two people, but the nights were haunted. The memory of their desperate union was too raw. He could not climb the ladder to the hayloft without feeling the shame of his hypocrisy. He was her husband, but he was not. He had claimed her, but he would not claim her. He began sleeping in the stall again, or riding out onto the prairie, sleeping under the stars, punishing himself with the cold. Clara felt the avoidance like a physical blow. She had given him the last of herself, and he had retreated. He was kind in the morning, but he left her alone at night. The guilt ate at her. She felt, once again, like the abandoned girl. Jesse saw the hurt in her eyes, and it only fed his own self-loathing. He was protecting her, he told himself, protecting her from the town's judgment, and from himself. But he knew he was just being a coward. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand her living in that barn, a symbol of their shame, and he couldn't bear to bring her into the town's poisonous orbit. He made a decision. He found a spot a few hundred yards outside the edge of Haven Creek, in a small grove of cottonwoods by the stream, using salvaged lumber from the storm, and some he bought with the last of his cattle drive money. He began to build. He worked from sunup to sundown. He did not ask for help, and none was offered. The town watched him. They saw him building a cabin, and the whispers started again. He was building their love nest. They said. Clara watched him, her heart torn. He worked with a frantic, punishing energy, his muscles straining, his face set. He was building a house for her. It was the first time anyone had ever built anything for her, but he was building it out there, away from the town, away from him. It was not a home they would share. It was a holding place. It was charity. When it was finished, after 4 days of relentless work, he took her to it. It was one small, sturdy room. He had built a cot, a small table, and a set of shelves. He had bought and installed a small, cast-iron stove. It was clean, and it was dry, and it was hers. It gives you independence, he said, his voice rough. He wouldn't look at her. You're out of the livery. You're safe. Safe, she repeated. She looked around the small, empty room. It felt as lonely as the prairie. Is that what this is? It's what I can give you, he said, and walked out. She accepted it. She moved her valise from the loft to the cabin. But she felt more torn than ever. She had wanted his companionship. He had given her a building, but the cabin, in its own way, began to heal them. It was a neutral ground. It was her space. He began to visit. He didn't come inside, not at first. He would leave a rabbit he'd shot, or a small bag of coffee, on the porch. Then, one evening, she was outside, tending to the small, stubborn garden they had started. He rode up, dismounted, and just stood there, watching her. "The carrots won't come up before the freeze," he said. "I know," she said, not looking up. "But it feels good to try." He walked over. He took the spade from her hand and began to turn the soil near the edge of the patch. "Kale might, if we bank it with straw." They worked side by side, in the twilight. When they were done, she went inside to wash her hands. He hesitated, then followed her to the porch. I made stew," she said, her back to him. He came inside. They ate at the small table he had built. They shared the meal, the silence comfortable for the first time. It was a small, fragile domesticity. They were rebuilding trust, not with words or apologies, but with shared work and shared food. They tended the patch of earth. He mended the cabin's roof. She mended his shirt. The wounds were still there, deep and septic, but a thin, new skin was beginning to grow. The fragile peace lasted for 6 days. Jesse was in the mercantile, buying flour and salt for Clara. When Sheriff Brody approached him, Brody was a tall, weary man who had seen too much and preferred to see less. "Cole," he said, his voice low. "A word." They stepped out onto the porch. The day was bright, the air cold. "Got a wire this morning from the marshal in Lawrence," Brody said, not looking at him. "Man's coming in on the stage, due tomorrow. Name of Elias Morrow." The name meant nothing to Jesse. "What's it to me?" Brody finally looked at him. His eyes were flat. "He's coming for your wife. He's a merchant, back in Kansas. Got money. He's filed some kind of claim. Says she was his intended. Says you abandoned her and the marriage ain't valid." Jesse's blood went cold. Kansas, a suitor, a man with money. "He's spreading the story that she's unwell," Brody continued, clearly disliking the taste of the words. "That she's fixated on you. He's coming to rescue her. I'm telling you this, Cole, because I don't want trouble. Men like Morrow, they don't ride this far unless they mean to get what they came for." Jesse's mind went straight to his last conversation with Clara. "He can give you a life, a real one. I can't." The words he'd said in guilt now felt like a terrible prophecy. "It's her choice," Jesse said, his voice wooden. "Maybe," Brody said, turning to go. "But men like that have a way of making the choice for you." The next day, the stage arrived. Jesse was there. Clara was beside him. He had told her, and she was terrified. A man stepped out of the coach. He was the opposite of Jesse in every way. He wore a fine, black wool suit, a clean white shirt, and a bowler hat. He was clean-shaven, his face smooth and confident, and he carried a silver-headed cane. He looked at the ruined town with distaste, until his eyes found Clara. His face broke into a warm, proprietary smile. "Clara, my dear," he said, stepping forward. He ignored Jesse completely, as if he were a fence post. He took Clara's hand and kissed her gloved knuckles. Clara snatched her hand back. "Elias, what are you doing here?" "I've been searching for you for months, my dear," Elias Morrow said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Since you vanished from Lawrence, I was worried sick. I followed a rumor you'd come west. I'm here to take you home." The townsfolk, including Mrs. Davies and the preacher, had gathered. Morrow turned to them, his voice projecting. "A terrible misunderstanding," he said, gesturing to Clara, then to Jesse. "This poor woman, she has been unwell since her father's passing. She fixated on this memory of a soldier from years ago, a man who, as you all know, abandoned her." He smiled, a sad, compassionate smile. "I am Elias Morrow, her neighbor, her father, on his deathbed, entrusted her to my care. She is my intended. I am simply here to bring her home, where she can be safe and recover." The story was perfect. It was logical. It painted Clara as a victim, Morrow as a savior, and Jesse as the villain. The townsfolk nodded. This made sense. That night, the conflict came to a head in Clara's small cabin. Morrow was there, Jesse was there, and Clara stood between them, trapped. "Clara, this nonsense has gone on long enough," Morrow said, his tone no longer gentle, but firm. "Pack your valise. I have purchased 2 tickets for the stage. We leave in the morning." "Elias, you don't understand," Clara said, her voice shaking. She looked at Jesse, pleading. "Jesse and I, we—" "You what?" Morrow scoffed. Finally, looking at Jesse, he looked him up and down, from his worn boots to his scarred face. "What has this man offered you? This shack? A life of being mocked as a harlot? I'm offering you a home, Clara, a fine house in Lawrence. Respect my name. I will make you my wife, as your father wished." Jesse was silent. He stared at the rough floorboards he had nailed down. Every word Morrow spoke was a hammer blow against his own self-hatred. "He's right. He's a whole man. I'm a ghost. I'm poison." "Jesse," Clara's voice was a whisper. "Say something." Jesse looked up. His eyes were dead. The fire they'd seen in the saloon, the warmth from the garden. It was all gone. He was the man who had ridden away from her in Kansas. "He's right," Jesse said, his voice thick. "He can give you a life. He can give you respect, a name, children. I can't give you anything but this, shame, and a hard life." Clara stared at him, her face crumbling. "What? After the storm? After everything you told me?" "I won't fight him for you," Jesse said, his voice breaking. He was tearing his own heart out. "You ain't a possession. You're not a prize to be won. You have to choose." He thought he was giving her freedom. He thought he was finally doing the right, noble thing, setting her free from the broken man who had only ever hurt her. But Clara didn't hear nobility. She heard rejection. She heard, "I don't love you enough to fight for you." It was the final abandonment. She had fought the town. She had fought her past. She had fought her own grief. And now, the one man she had allowed back into her heart was stepping aside, holding the door open for another man to take her. Her heart, which had just begun to heal, broke completely. "I see," she said, her voice dead. The tears came, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. "You're doing it again. You're leaving me. Clara, I see," she repeated. She turned her back on him, facing Elias Morrow. Her shoulders were straight, but her spirit was gone. "I will be ready in the morning," Morrow smiled, a small, triumphant curl of his lips. He nodded at Jesse, a victor's nod, and left the cabin. Jesse stood there, his hands clenched, his entire body rigid with the effort of not screaming. He had done it. He had saved her. He had saved her from himself, and it was killing him. He turned and left her, without another word. The next morning, the stagecoach was ready. Morrow, immaculate in his suit, loaded Clara's small valise. He helped her up the step, his hand possessive on her elbow. Clara paused. She looked across the street. Jesse was standing on the mercantile porch, in the exact same spot he'd been standing the day she arrived. Their eyes locked across the dusty expanse. Her face was a mask of utter misery, a silent, final plea. "Stop this. Say the word. Just one word." Jesse Cole stood like a statue carved from granite and gilt. He watched her. He held her gaze. He felt his own soul tearing in two. But he said nothing. He gave her nothing. He held fast to his sacrifice, believing it was the only decent thing he had ever done for her. He was letting her go, so she could be safe. He saw her face crumple. The last light of hope died in her eyes. She turned, her back rigid, and disappeared into the darkness of the coach. Morrow tipped his hat to Jesse, a final, mocking salute. He climbed in, and the door shut. The driver cracked his whip. The coach lurched, the wheels grinding in the dirt. It gathered speed, rolling past the edge of town, past the small, empty cabin in the cottonwoods, and disappeared down the trail to South Pass, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust that hung in the cold morning air. Jesse stood and watched the dust. He watched it until it settled, until the street was empty, until the only sound was the wind whistling through the ruined church. He was, once again, a man without a wife, without a home. He was, once again, completely and utterly alone. The dust Clara's coach left behind settled, but the silence it left in Haven Creek did not. For Jesse, the world went quiet. The hammering of the rebuild, the arguments in the saloon, the constant Wyoming wind, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. His solitude, once a comfort, was now a prison. Days turned into a week, then 2. The hollow ache of her absence was a physical thing, a constant companion more real than any person. He drifted back into his lonely routines. He fixed fences for homesteaders, his hands moving with mechanical precision, his mind 1,000 miles down the trail. He drank alone, but the whiskey no longer blurred the memories, it sharpened them. He saw her face, her eyes as she'd looked at him from the coach window, that last, heartbreaking look of betrayal. He had won. He had set her free. He had saved her from himself, and in doing so, he had torn out his own lungs. He stopped sleeping in the livery. He couldn't. He moved into the small cabin he had built for her. It was torture. Everything in it was a reminder. The smell of the new sawn pine, the small stove he had set, the empty cot. He'd sit on the porch in the freezing dark, staring at the patch of kale they had planted, now black with frost. He was haunted, not by the girl he'd married, but by the woman he had driven away. He had finally faced his past, only to execute his future. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after she had gone, he was in the saloon. He wasn't drinking. He was just sitting in his corner, trying to gather the will to ride on. There was nothing left for him in Haven Creek. The rebuilding was almost done. The town had returned to its quiet judgment. He was, once more, the outsider, a freighter, a man Jesse had never seen before. Pushed through the doors, shaking ice from his heavy coat. He ordered a whiskey and addressed the room. "Don't no one take the South Pass Trail by the Sweetwater," the man said, his voice loud. "It's a graveyard." The saloon quieted. "Bandits," the freighter continued, downing his drink. "Ugly business. Found a stagecoach, turned over. Been there a week, maybe more. Wolves and vultures had been at it." Jesse's heart, which he thought had stopped beating weeks ago, gave a single, painful jolt. "Found the driver," the man said, warming to his story. "And a passenger, man in a fine suit. Looked like a rich man from back east. Arrow in his back. They took the horses, the strong box. Everything left him to rot." A cold dread, colder than the ice on the man's coat, crept up Jesse's spine. "When?" Jesse's voice was a dry croak. The freighter squinted at him. "When what? When was the coach due?" "Hell, I don't know. The one that left here? What, 2, 3 weeks back? Heading east. That'd be the one." The room blurred. Jesse was on his feet, his chair crashing backward. "Survivors?" The freighter shook his head, pouring another drink. "Didn't see none. Just those 2 bodies. Looked bad. Friend. Real bad. I didn't linger. No sense in it." Jesse was out the door before the man had raised the glass to his lips. He didn't go to the cabin. He didn't pack supplies. He didn't grab a coat. He ran to the livery, threw his saddle on his horse, grabbed his rifle from the scabbard, and mounted. His self-hatred, his carefully constructed sacrifice, it all evaporated. There was no thought. There was no nobility. There was only one pure, agonizing word: Clara. He dug his heels into the horse's flanks and rode out of Haven Creek like a man possessed, plunging into the black, stormy night. He had sent her away to be safe, and he had sent her to her death. The night turned on him. A new storm, born of ice and sleet, roared down from the mountains. It was not a storm to be ridden in. It was a storm to be survived. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving the frozen rain into his face until his skin was numb and raw. He didn't slow. The landscape, familiar by day, became a treacherous alien world. The trail turned into a sucking, freezing morass of mud that tried to pull the shoes from his horse. The animal stumbled, whinnying in terror, but Jesse spurred on, his own desperation a brutal force. He was not just riding against the storm. He was riding against his own cowardice. He was riding against the 9 years he had lost, and the 3 weeks he had thrown away. He was riding against the man who stood on the porch and said nothing. Lightning split the sky, illuminating a world of heaving mud and rising water. The small creeks he'd crossed easily with Clara in the wagon were now raging, brown torrents. His horse balked at the edge of one, but Jesse drove it forward, plunging into the icy water. They were swept downstream, fighting for purchase, before scrambling up the far bank, soaked and shaking. His entire body was a block of ice. His hands were numb, frozen to the reins. His mind was filled with a single, repeating prayer. Let me be in time. Let her be alive. Let me be in time. He rode for hours. The storm was a screaming devil, and his horse was failing. He was following the South Pass Trail by memory, by the dimmest outline of the hills against the black sky. Just as he thought the horse could not take another step, a flash of lightning revealed it. Down in a gully, near the roaring, flooded banks of the Sweetwater River, was the wreck. It was just as the freighter had described, a shattered coach, overturned, its wheels pointing to the sky like the hands of a drowning man. He smelled it before he saw it clearly, the scent of wet wool and death. He slid from the saddle, his legs collapsing under him, and pulled his rifle. He stumbled through the mud, his lantern beam cutting through the driving sleet. The driver was slumped over the front axle, his body stiff, a few yards away. Half submerged in the mud was Elias Morrow. His fine suit was torn and filthy, his face a gray, empty mask, his eyes wide with the surprise of his own death. Jesse's heart was in his throat. He searched, his lantern beam sweeping the wreckage, the rocks, the river bank. There was no one else. "Clara!" he roared, his voice ripped away by the wind. "Clara!" He heard it. It was not a cry. It was a sound so faint he thought the wind was fooling him. A low, whimpering moan. It was coming from under the carriage. He dropped the lantern, its light falling on the overturned coach. He plunged his hands into the mud, crawling toward the sound. "Clara!" He saw her, just her hand, sticking out from under the heavy, splintered wooden body of the coach. The carriage had settled, pinning her beneath it. "Jesse!" Her voice was a thread, a breath. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "I'm here," he yelled. "I'm here! Clara! I'm coming!" He shoved his shoulder against the wreck. It was like pushing a mountain. It didn't budge. Panic, hot and sharp, flooded him. The river was rising. The mud was turning to quicksand. She was trapped. "I'm going to lift," he gasped, his breath pluming. "When I lift, you crawl. You hear me? You crawl out." I can't. My arm." "You will," he commanded, the authority in his voice absolute. He set his feet in the sucking mud. He jammed his shoulder under the frame, right where his old wound was. He didn't think about the pain. He didn't think about anything but her hand. He drew a breath, held it, and lifted. He roared, a sound that was not human. It was the sound of 9 years of guilt, of grief, of self-hatred, all focused into one impossible effort. His muscles screamed. The old scar tissue on his shoulder tore open with a wet, searing agony. He felt something pop, a sharp, white-hot pain that blacked out his vision for a second. But the carriage moved. It lifted. An inch, 3 inches, a foot. "Now!" he screamed, the veins in his neck standing out. He saw her move, a dark shape, dragging itself, pushing with one leg, one arm, out from under the death trap. She was a broken thing, covered in mud, but she was moving. "Keep coming!" he gasped, his teeth gritted, his entire body shaking with the strain. She cleared the edge of the coach. She was free. He let it go. The carriage crashed back into the mud. Jesse collapsed, falling to his knees, his left arm hanging useless, dead at his side. The pain was so vast, so complete, that he almost passed out. But she was alive. She was crawling to him. "Jesse, your arm, your shoulder!" The sleet was turning to a heavy, wet snow. They would freeze to death in minutes. "Cave!" he bit out, his teeth chattering. He'd seen it as he rode up, a shadow in the rocks, just above the floodline. "Got to get to the cave." He forced himself to his feet. Grabbing his rifle with his good hand, he hauled her up. She screamed as he pulled her, her left arm dangling at an unnatural angle. It was broken. "I know," he panted. "I know. Just hold on to me." He wrapped his one good arm around her waist. She leaned on him, her good hand gripping his shirt, half dragging her, half carrying her. He waded through the mud and rising water, stumbling toward the dark cleft in the rock face. They fell inside, collapsing onto the dry, stone floor. It was nothing more than a shallow hollow, but it was out of the wind. It was shelter. They were soaked, frozen, and shattered. "Fire!" he gasped. He fumbled with his saddlebags, which he'd had the presence of mind to cut from his horse. His fingers were numb, but he managed to pull out his tinderbox and a handful of dry kindling he kept wrapped in oilcloth. His left arm was useless. He couldn't use it. He struck the flint with his right hand, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely hold it. A spark caught. He nurtured it, blowing on it, until a small, weak flame licked at the wood. A fire, a tiny beacon in the vast, roaring blackness. He unfastened his bedroll with his teeth in his good hand, pulling the wool blankets free. They were damp, but they were warmer than their soaked clothes. "Your coat," he ordered. They fumbled, him with one arm, her with one arm, helping each other out of the freezing wet layers. They were a pathetic, broken pair. In the flickering light, he saw her. Her face was cut, a dark bruise swelling over her eye. Her arm was clearly broken, the bone bent just above the wrist. He saw her look at his shoulder. The shirt was soaked with blood, the old scar split wide open. Without a word, she took her one good hand, reached for the hem of her petticoat, and ripped a long, clean strip of cloth. Her movements were clumsy, pained. "Let me," she whispered. She made a sling, her cold fingers brushing his neck as she tied it, supporting the dead weight of his arm. The simple touch was agonizing, and it was the only thing keeping him conscious. He, in turn, found 2 flat pieces of wood from the broken coach, which had washed near the cave. He gently, grimly, set her arm between them. She fainted for a moment when he pulled the bone straight, but he bound it tightly with another strip of cloth. They huddled together, wrapped in the blankets, leaning against each other. There were no words. There was only the sound of the storm, the crackle of the fire, and the shallow P_aimed breathing of 2 people who should be dead. They drifted, not into sleep, but into an exhausted, pained stupor. Just before the gray light of dawn, Jesse woke. The fire was embers. The storm had quieted to a low moan. He was cold, but the woman beside him was colder. She was shivering violently in his arms, her teeth chattering. She was crying in her sleep. Small, terrified sounds, the same ones he'd heard in the livery. "No, please, don't leave," she whimpered. "Jesse, don't leave me again, please." Her eyes snapped open. She saw him, a dark, one-armed shape in the dim light of the cave. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, still trapped in the nightmare. "Jesse!" she cried out, a sound of pure, childlike terror. She scrambled, trying to get away, thinking he was a ghost or that she was alone again. "You left me!" He grabbed her, his one good arm wrapping around her like a steel band, pulling her against his chest. He held her tight, his chin pressed against the top of her head. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick and raw. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." She clung to him. The terror broke, and a flood of tears, of all the weeks of abandonment and fear, poured out. She sobbed, her whole body shaking. I thought you let me go. I thought you were gone." He held her, rocking her gently, his own eyes burning. "I did," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I was a fool. Clara, a goddamn fool. I thought I was saving you. I was just being a coward. The same coward I've always been." He pulled back, just enough to look at her in the pale, gray light. Her face was a ruin of bruises and tears. "Not this time," he said, his voice a vow. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, grieving kiss from the storm cabin. This was something else. It was a promise. It was forgiveness. It was a raw, unspoken, and redemptive thing. He kissed the cut on her forehead, the bruise on her cheek, the salt of her tears. His mouth found hers. And it was not a kiss of passion, but of arrival. It was a desperate physical confirmation that she was alive, that he was alive, and that they were, somehow, together. She kissed him back, her one good hand clutching the front of his bloody shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. As the sun rose, the storm was gone. The world outside the cave was a flooded, muddy wasteland. But it was quiet. They sat, leaning against each other. They were exhausted, broken, and in terrible pain. But the frantic terror had passed. Clara rested her head on his good shoulder. She was quiet for a long time. "Jesse," she whispered, her voice hoarse. What do we do now?" He looked out at the wrecked landscape, at the swollen, angry river, at the gray, unforgiving sky. He thought of the empty cabin in the cottonwoods. He thought of the 9 years, and the child, and the cowardice. It was all still there. The past could not be erased. It was part of them, like his scar, like her broken arm. But they were not ghosts. Not anymore. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. "Now," he said, his voice rough, "we go home, together." The walk back to Haven Creek was an agony. It took the rest of that day and half of the next. Jesse's horse, exhausted and spooked, could only carry one of them at a time. They took turns. He would lift Clara onto the saddle, his one good arm straining, the muscles in his back screaming in protest. Then he would walk beside her, his useless, throbbing shoulder jarring with every step, his hand gripping the stirrup leather for balance. When he could walk no further, she would slide down, her own face pale with the pain of her splinted arm. And they would sit, huddled together in the mud, until they found the strength to go on. They spoke little. The vow in the cave, the raw, redemptive kiss, had been a promise for a future. The present was about survival. Every shared sip of water from his canteen, every time his good hand steadied her on the rough terrain, was an unspoken confirmation of that vow. He was not leaving her. She was not letting him go. They were a grim sight when they finally crested the low rise that overlooked Haven Creek. They were caked in mud, their clothes torn and stained. Jesse's sling was soaked in old, dark blood. Clara's face was a map of purple and black bruises. Silas, the farrier, was the first to see them. He was shoeing a mule outside the livery, and he dropped the hoof, standing frozen for a long second. He had seen men return from massacres who looked better. "My God," he breathed. He dropped his tools and ran toward them, his face a mask of shock. "Cole, Mrs. Cole, what in heaven's name?" Jesse's horse, seeing the livery, gave a final, weary sigh and stopped, its head hanging. Jesse leaned against it, his good arm holding Clara steady as she swayed in the saddle. "Bandits," Jesse said. His voice was a dry, rasping sound. "The coach, 3, maybe 4 days ago, near the Sweetwater." Silas stared, his mind connecting the dots. The freighter's story, the wrecked coach, and Jesse Cole, who had ridden out into a blizzard. He had gone back. He had ridden into that ice storm, found her, and brought her home. The word spread with the speed of a lit fuse. Doors opened. Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, stepped onto the mercantile porch, her hand flying to her mouth. She saw Clara's broken arm. She saw the blood on Jesse's shirt. Her eyes, usually so sharp with judgment, widened with something else, horror, and a creeping, dawning shame. This was not the tawdry sin she had imagined. This was something brutal, something real. "Get her down," Silas ordered, his voice taking charge. "Hank, give me a hand." Hank, the teamster Jesse had nearly choked in the saloon, emerged. He looked at Jesse, at the useless, bloody arm, at the raw determination on his face, and his own bluster evaporated. He nodded, his expression grim, and moved to help. "No," Jesse grunted. He waved Hank off. He looked at Clara. "I got her." Using his one good arm, he locked his hand around her waist. She leaned into him, her good arm wrapping around his neck. He lifted her, his knees buckling for a second under the strain. The pain in his shoulders so blinding he almost screamed. But he did not drop her. He held her, setting her gently on her feet. She sagged against him, and he held her up. They stood there, two broken, shattered people, leaning on each other. And the town, for the first time, saw them. Not as the deserter and the harlot, not as the sinner and the grifter. They saw a man who had ridden into hell to save his wife, Mrs. Miller, the woman whose hand Clara had bandaged, pushed through the small crowd. She was carrying a bucket of clean water and a handful of white cloths. Her face was set, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective pity. "Bring her to the cabin," she said, her voice firm, directed at Jesse. "The one you built, it's clean. I had it aired out." She had been looking after it. It seemed... She looked at Mrs. Davies, a challenge in her eyes. "And fetch the doctor from South Pass, or at least his bag. Silas, send a man. This will need more than salve." The judgment of Haven Creek had not evaporated. It had simply been overwhelmed by a truth it could not deny. The whispers that followed them as Jesse and Silas helped Clara to the small cabin in the cottonwoods were no longer of sin. They were of the attack, of Elias Morrow's death, of the storm, and of the raw courage it had taken for Jesse to bring her back. They spent the next 2 weeks healing. Their wounds were severe. Jesse's shoulder was a ruin, the old scar torn open, the muscle badly damaged. Clara's arm was a clean break, but it was agonizing. They were trapped in the small cabin, dependent on the hesitant kindness of the town. Mrs. Miller came every day. She brought broth, she changed their bandages, and she spoke in quiet, practical tones. Mrs. Davies came once, with the preacher. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped, and looked at the two of them, him on the floor bedroll, her on the cot. "The Lord works in punishing ways," she said, her voice tight. "We are grateful you were spared." It was as close to an apology as she would ever come. Clara, pale but her voice steady, just nodded. "Thank you for the broth, Mrs. Davies." Preacher Davies himself was a different matter. He was a man of rigid, public morality, and he had made a rigid, public error. He came alone, a few days later, when Jesse and Clara were finally able to sit on the porch in the weak autumn sun. He cleared his throat, holding his black hat in both hands. He did not look at them, but at the frost-bitten garden. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole," he began. The Mrs. sounding stiff in his mouth. "It has been made clear to me, by the facts of the situation, that I spoke in haste." Jesse said nothing. He watched the preacher, his face impassive. "The town, we were misled, by circumstance, by appearances." He took a deep breath. "That man, Mr. Morrow, was a liar. And you, sir," he looked at Jesse, "acted as a husband ought. You saved your wife's life. The town owes you its respect for that. And I owe you an apology." Jesse just nodded once. "Therefore," the preacher continued, getting to his point, "it is only right that this confusion be put to rest permanently. That marriage certificate you hold is a legal document. It is time it was blessed by God and acknowledged by this community." He was not asking. He was telling. The next Sunday, in the partially rebuilt church, Haven Creek gathered. Jesse, his arm still in a heavy sling, stood at the front. Clara, her own splinted arm resting against her, stood beside him. They were not dressed in wedding clothes. They wore the same mended, clean clothes they wore every day. It was not a wedding. It was an acknowledgement. Preacher Davies opened his Bible. He did not preach a sermon on sin. He preached one on forgiveness and on the strength of the marriage vow. He spoke of trial by fire and trial by ice, and he looked at Jesse and Clara. "By the authority vested in me by God and by the laws of this territory, I ask this congregation to bear witness," he announced, his voice booming, "that Jesse Cole and Clara Cole are, and have been lawfully wed. What God has joined together, let no man, or rumor, put asunder. You may be seated." There was an awkward pause. Then Silas, in the back, began to clap. It was a slow, steady applause. Mrs. Miller joined him. Then, one by one, the rest of the town. It was not a celebration. It was a confirmation. Jesse looked at Clara. She was crying, silent tears tracing the faint, fading bruises on her cheek. He reached out with his good hand and, in front of God and the entire town, he wiped her tears away. Their life began. They moved into the small cabin, and for the first time, it was not a refuge, or a prison, or a place of charity. It was a home. Time passed. The raw wounds of the attack healed, leaving new scars to layer over the old. His shoulder would always be stiff. Her arm would always ache when the cold came. But they were whole. Winter set in. A hard, brutal Wyoming winter. They faced it together. He taught her to shoot his rifle, one-handed, in case he was gone. She learned to mend and cook with her left hand while her right healed. They were a team, bound by the simple, daily tasks of survival. When the spring thaw finally came, it felt like a resurrection. The world turned from brown to a fragile, hopeful green. "It's time," Clara said one morning, testing the give of the soil with her boot. They planted the garden again, not the small, hopeless patch of kale, but a real garden. They worked side by side. Jesse, his strength returned, turned the heavy soil. Clara, her arm now free of the splint, followed, breaking the clods, her hands sinking into the rich, dark earth. They planted potatoes, and beans, and corn, and carrots for the winter. They laughed when a gopher stole their first seedling. Jesse didn't laugh the rusty, broken sound he had before. He laughed a deep, quiet laugh, and Clara's answering smile was open and bright. One day, Jesse came back from town leading a new life. It was a spindly, long-legged colt, barely a month old, its mother having been taken by a wolf. Silas had given it to him. For the trouble, it became theirs. They raised it by hand. Clara would boil milk and oats, and they would feed it together from a bucket. Jesse spent hours in the small corral he built, his voice low and patient, teaching the colt to accept a touch, then a rope, then a halter. They were nurturing something young and new and whole. Clara, too, found her place. The town's children were growing wild, with no school and little hope of one. Clara, with her quiet strength and her clear, educated hand, offered to teach them. She started with 3 in her own cabin. Then Mrs. Davies, seeing the progress, offered the church on weekdays. Soon, Clara had 10 children. She became Mrs. Cole, the teacher. She was no longer the outcast. She was a pillar. She was giving the town the one thing it could not build for itself, a future. Jesse, in turn, worked the land. He was no longer the drifter, the haunted cowboy. He was Clara's husband. He was the man who had built a home, who was raising a fine horse, and whose small farm was neat and prosperous. He was quiet, still. He would always be quiet. But the distance in his eyes was gone. When he looked at his wife, he was present. The past could not be erased. It was as much a part of their home as the wood in the walls. There were nights when Jesse woke in a cold sweat, the smell of gunpowder in his nose, the ghost of Elijah from Ohio whispering in his ear. But before the panic could take hold, he would feel a hand on his back. He would turn, and Clara would be there, her eyes clear and steady in the moonlight, pulling him back from the shadows. And there were nights when Clara would wake, her hands clenched, her heart aching with a hollow, familiar grief. One night, deep in the autumn, As the first chill of the next winter crept under the door, they sat before the fire. The cabin was warm. The harvest was in. It was peaceful. But Jessie saw her. She was staring into the flames, her hands twisting in her lap, her face lost in that old, familiar sorrow. He sat beside her on the hearth, saying nothing, just being there. "I dreamed of him again," she whispered, her voice thick. "Of Thomas?" Jessie's heart clenched. The old Jessie would have frozen, trapped in his own guilt. The new Jessie simply put his arm around her, pulling her close. I was in the snow." She wept, the tears she'd held back finally falling. "I was trying to find him. I could hear him crying, but I couldn't reach him. He was so cold. Jessie, I couldn't get him warm." Jessie held her. He held her as she sobbed, as the 9-year-old grief poured out of her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He just held her, sharing the terrible, cold weight of it. "I know," he whispered into her hair, his own voice breaking. "I know." He let her cry, until the sobs quieted into shudders. He held her face between his hands, his rough thumbs wiping the tears from her cheeks. "We can't change that, Clara," he said, his voice raw with a truth that hurt. "We can't go back. We can't make him warm." She looked at him, her eyes drowning in the loss. "But maybe," he said, his voice low, his gaze holding hers. "Maybe God gave us another chance, not to replace him. We could never do that, but a chance. Right here." He touched his chest, then hers. "A chance in each other." She leaned her forehead against his, and they stayed like that. Two scarred souls, finally breathing the same air. Their shared grief not a wall, but a foundation. Weeks later, the first true snow of the season began to fall. It was not the violent, driving sleet of the blizzard, but a soft, quiet blanket, settling over the valley. Jessie and Clara stood on the small porch he had built. He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. They watched the flakes drift down, covering the garden, covering the small corral, covering the roof of their home. They knew the cold would come. They knew the winter would be long and hard, but this time they would face it together. He'd once believed himself a man without a wife, without a home, but as the snow fell soft around them, Jessie Cole finally understood. Love hadn't been lost, only waiting. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We truly appreciate you spending your time with us. We would love to hear from you. Please take a moment to comment and let us know where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed this story, we hope you'll subscribe to From Wild West so you never miss a new tale. And finally, please share your thoughts on Jessie and Clara's journey, in English, in the comments. We look forward to reading what you think.